All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we're diving headfirst into a truly dark part of Brooklyn's history. The story of Vincent Johnson, better known as the Brooklyn Strangler. Now, this guy actually confessed to his crimes, but that doesn't mean the story's simple, right? We're going way beyond the surface, beyond just the basic facts you might find on Wikipedia. We're going to be talking about the crimes themselves, the DNA evidence, the psychology of this guy. We're looking at the whole picture, the whole 9 yards to see, what we can really glean from this case.
Yeah, it's going to be pretty intense.
Yeah.
We're talking about a serial killer, someone who preyed on a very specific group of women. And his motive is, well, let's just say it's way more complex than it first appears.
Oh, for sure. Between 1999 and 2000, Johnson, he terrorized the Williamsburg and Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhoods, and all of his victims, Patricia Sullivan, Rhonda Tucker, Joanne Feliciano, Vivian Caraballo, and Laura Nusser. They all shared this really heartbreaking commonality. They were all, struggling with addiction, and they were forced into sex work. And there might have even been a sixth victim, a woman named Katrina Niles, though Johnson denied having anything to do with her death.
And that's a really important point to consider, right? You see, these women weren't just, random targets. They were already living on the margins of society, often overlooked, often forgotten. And that, sadly, made them incredibly vulnerable to predators like Johnson.
Yeah, it makes you think about who society protects and who it doesn't. So initially, the police thought they had their guy. They arrested a homeless man, someone familiar with the sex worker community, which makes sense on the surface. But get this, they were wrong.
That's where this case takes a huge turn. And it all comes down to the power of DNA testing, which is why this case is so important. This is right around the time when DNA profiling was becoming more common, more widely used.
Oh, that's interesting.
Before DNA testing, Johnson might have gotten away with it. Who knows?
Yeah.
This technology, it completely revolutionized the way we investigate and solve crimes.
It's crazy to think how much we rely on it now.
Yeah, so in this case, it exonerated the initial suspect and, more importantly, it pointed directly at Vincent Johnson.
So how did they get Johnson's DNA? That's what I want to know.
Well, it's kind of a crazy story.
It's like something out of a movie or something.
Yeah, it really is. So remember that wrongfully accused homeless man?
Yeah.
Well, he actually ended up playing a really big role in catching the real killer.
No way.
He did.
Yeah.
He befriended the police, got to know them, and he actually gave them some really valuable insights, into the world that these women were living in. And he dropped this really crucial detail about Johnson. He mentioned that Johnson had this, disturbing fixation on sadomasochistic sex. And that actually became super relevant later on in the investigation.
Wow. So even though he was completely innocent, he still helped catch the real killer.
Exactly. Pretty wild. Nice.
Absolutely. And there's this other story about how the detectives actually caught Johnson. You're not going to believe this. It's because of his spitting habit.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
A detective was just, doing their thing and walking down the street. And they saw Johnson spitting. And I don't know, something about it just felt off to them. So they collected his saliva as evidence, just on a hunch, really.
Oh.
And bam, it matched the DNA that they'd found on 4 of the victims.
It sounds like something out of a TV show.
It really does. But it shows you how even the tiniest, seemingly insignificant details can be absolutely crucial in solving a case.
Yeah, you never know what's going to break a case open. Now, this wasn't just some random act of violence. Johnson actually confessed to killing 5 women. But here's the really creepy part. He showed absolutely zero remorse. And get this, he specifically told police that he chose to strangle women on Thursdays. Can you believe that? Thursdays. Because he hated that his mother got Thursdays off from work.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I remember that. I mean, how do you even process that?
It's like he was creating his own twisted schedule based on, I don't know, maternal resentment.
It's really bizarre, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
That detail really makes you think about what was going on inside his head. It wasn't just about violence,
Yeah.
This points to some seriously deep-seated psychological issues, possibly stemming from a really, really troubled relationship with his mother.
Yeah, I mean, it's scary to think about. He was taking all his rage out on these women. It's almost like they were stand-ins for his mother in some sick, twisted way.
It's a classic case of displacement, projecting his anger onto these vulnerable women, and the fact that he chose Thursdays specifically, his mother's day off, it adds this whole other layer of chilling calculation to it all.
Oh, absolutely. So, okay, you'd think that a serial killer would want to, cover their tracks. But Johnson, he bound the bodies of his victims, but he didn't actually try to hide them. What do you make of that?
That's where things get really complicated.
Yeah.
On the one hand, it could seem like, carelessness, like he just didn't care. But on the other hand, and this is a really disturbing thought, it could be a sign that he actually wanted to be caught.
Oh, wow.
Like it was this perverse display of power.
So he's controlling the narrative even after committing the crimes.
Exactly. He wanted the police, everyone, to know exactly what he had done.
Yeah.
It's a scary thought, but it's a pattern you see sometimes in serial killer cases. This deep need for control, this desire to leave their mark on the world in this horrific way.
It's chilling.
They want to be recognized, to be feared, and yeah, sometimes even to be stopped.
Yeah. That's a lot to take in. I think we need to take a break and process all of this. We'll be back in a few minutes to dig even deeper into the Brooklyn Strangler case. We're back, and I gotta say, this case is really heavy stuff. We're talking about Vincent Johnson, the Brooklyn Strangler, trying to, wrap our heads around what he did and why. We left off talking about his motive, but is hating Thursdays really all there is to it? I mean, how does that lead someone to become a serial killer?
Well, that's where we have to go a little bit deeper, into the psychology of serial killers. It's a really complex field, and every case is different, of course. But we do see some pretty disturbing patterns emerge when you start looking at a lot of these cases together.
What kind of patterns?
Well, think about Johnson's choice of victims.
Hmm.
These were women who were struggling with addiction, forced into sex work. And to him, it's like they were less than human, expendable. This dehumanization, it's a common thread in a lot of serial killer psychology. It allows them to justify their actions, their horrific acts, in their own minds.
It's like they create this whole different reality in their heads where their victims are somehow deserving of their fate.
Exactly. It's a really scary thought.
So he had all this anger towards his mother, this resentment about her having Thursdays off, and he projected all of that onto these women.
It's a very likely scenario. He couldn't express that anger towards his mother directly, so it got all twisted, it got misdirected, and it came out in these terrible acts of violence against these vulnerable women.
And the fact that he chose Thursday as his mother's day off.
Oh yeah, that's really important. It adds this whole other level of calculation to his actions.
Yeah.
It's chilling.
Like he was trying to punish her in this really symbolic way. Let's talk a bit more about the strangulation. He used whatever he could find: shoelaces, drawstrings, electrical wire, anything.
Yeah, he was very opportunistic.
Why strangulation? Is there something specific about that method, that fits into this whole psychological puzzle we're trying to put together?
Well, strangulation is a very how do I put this? It's a very intimate and brutal method. It allows the killer to literally feel the life drain out of their victim. It's not just about ending a life, it's about control, it's about dominance, it's about having power over another human being in their final moments.
Yeah, I get that. And the fact that he used all these different ligatures, whatever, was just lying around, does that suggest he wasn't really planning these attacks? Like he was just acting on impulse?
It certainly points to that. It suggests someone who is driven by this very primal urge. Not someone who is meticulously planning out each attack. He saw an opportunity and he seized it with whatever he had at hand.
That's terrifying.
It is. And it also speaks to a level of disorganization that you sometimes see in these kinds of cases.
So he binds the bodies, but he doesn't try to hide them. We talked about this before, but the more we learn about him, the more I wonder, was he trying to get caught?
That's a question that comes up a lot in these cases. Did he want to be stopped? Was he leaving clues, almost like breadcrumbs for the investigators? Was he daring them to find him? It's impossible to say for sure. But the evidence does seem to suggest that he wasn't really all that concerned with concealing his crimes.
It goes back to that need for control, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. He's not just controlling his victims. He's controlling the whole narrative, even after the act itself.
That's a truly horrifying thought.
It is. It's this need to be recognized, to be feared.
Yeah.
And yeah, as I said before, sometimes even to be stopped.
It's all just so disturbing. And I keep thinking about those women, their lives were cut short in such a brutal way. What would you say, from everything we know about this case and others like it? What's the most important takeaway for our listeners?
I think the most important thing to remember is that these women were not just statistics in a case file. They were real people. They had lives, they had families, they had dreams. And their stories, however tragic, should serve as a reminder that we need to do more to protect the vulnerable people in our society.
That's a really powerful statement. Their lives mattered, and we can't forget that.
We can't.
Yeah.
And we can't ignore the fact that their struggles with addiction, with being forced into sex work, that made them targets. We have to address the root causes of these issues. Poverty, lack of opportunity, systemic inequality, if we really want to prevent these tragedies from happening again.
It's a sobering thought, but it's a thought we need to confront head on. We can't just focus on the darkness. We have to search for solutions, too.
Absolutely. Understanding the psychology behind these crimes is crucial, but it's only the first step. We need to take that understanding and turn it into action. Create a society that's more just, more compassionate, and ultimately safer for everyone.
Well said. We've gone really deep into the psychology of this case, and honestly, it's a lot to process. So what happens after Johnson is arrested? We know he's serving a life sentence. But did the story did it just end there? I mean, there's a whole community that was left to deal with the aftermath.
You're right. The story doesn't end with the arrest.
Right.
These crimes had a ripple effect, and it's important to understand that impact as well.
So we've been on this really heavy journey with this case, learning about Vincent Johnson and what he did. But as we wrap up our deep dive into the Brooklyn Strangler, I kind of want to shift focus a little bit to the aftermath. Johnson's behind bars now. He's serving a life sentence. But what about the people he left behind in Williamsburg and Bedford-Stuyvesant? What was the impact of all of this on those communities?
Yeah, you have to imagine what it was like to live in those neighborhoods back then. I mean, these murders, they sent shockwaves through the entire community. And it wasn't just the brutality of the crimes themselves, right? It was the realization that these women who were already living on the edge of society, they were essentially invisible,
Hmm.
to the rest of us. And their deaths, they really exposed that harsh reality.
Yeah, it's like their struggles were only acknowledged when it was too late, and that must have been terrifying for other people in similar
Oh,
situations.
absolutely, yeah. Fear gripped those communities. People were afraid to walk alone, especially women. They were constantly looking over their shoulders.
Hmm.
That sense of safety it was shattered.
It's heartbreaking. These crimes, they didn't just end lives, they created this whole climate of fear, a fear that lingered long after Johnson was caught. Speaking of which, we mentioned the court TV series Brooklyn North earlier. I know you're a real true crime fan. So what made this case, what made it stand out enough to be featured on a show like that?
Well, Brooklyn North, it wasn't just about the crimes themselves. It was about the detectives, the pressures that they were facing, the whole system, really. The episodes about the Brooklyn Strangler, they were definitely gripping, no doubt. But what made them so compelling was how they showed the investigation from the inside out.
Hmm.
You saw the detectives' frustration when they hit dead ends,
Yeah.
and then the relief when that DNA hit finally came back.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But it wasn't just about the science. The show really humanized the victims. They showed their lives, beyond their struggles.
Which is so important, right? I mean, these women, they weren't just case numbers. They were people. They had families, they had hopes, they had dreams. Did it explore any of that?
They did, yeah. They interviewed family members. They showed photos. They really tried to paint a full picture of who these women were. I think that's what made those episodes, really stick with people.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a whodunit. It was a tragedy with a real human cost.
And a cost that extended beyond the immediate victims, right? I mean, the whole community was affected by this. Do you think that the series did a good job of showing that wider impact?
I do, yeah. They interviewed community leaders, residents, even former sex workers who knew the victims.
Hmm.
And it gave a voice to those who often go unheard, and it forced viewers to really confront these uncomfortable realities of poverty, addiction, and the dangers that are faced by people who are living on the margins of society.
We've talked about a lot of dark stuff today, the psychology of this case, the impact it had. But as we come to the end of this deep dive, what do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to take away from all of this?
Well, I think this case shows us, in a very stark way,
Yeah.
that we can't ignore the vulnerable members of our society. These women, they were someone's daughters, they were someone's sisters, someone's friends. Their lives mattered, and their stories, they should compel us to ask ourselves, what can we do to prevent this from happening again?
That's a really powerful question, and one that I hope our listeners will really, really consider. It's not enough to just be horrified by the crime. We have to take that horror and turn it into action. We have to demand better for those who are struggling.
I completely agree. And it's about holding those in power accountable,
Yeah.
for creating systems that protect everyone, not just the privileged few. This case, it's not just about one man's horrific acts. It's a reflection of a society that allowed those acts to happen.
This has been a deeply unsettling but incredibly important conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today and for helping us navigate this incredibly complex case.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's so important to have these conversations, no matter how difficult they may be.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something today, that you were challenged to think critically, and maybe even felt a spark of motivation to make a difference in your own community. Remember, even the smallest acts of kindness, the smallest acts of awareness, they can have a ripple effect. So stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.